I'm Michael Bungay-Stania. This is Change Signal. This is the podcast where we cut through the blather and the BS and the noise to find the good stuff that works in change and transformation. Now, many of the people I've spoken to on the show have a really specific expertise. Rachel Botsman on trust, Leanne Davey on conflict, just to name two. And it is illuminating to bring that wisdom and those frameworks to bear on change and transformation. I mean, this is finding the good stuff that works. But it can't all be theory. As the baseball player Yogi Berra wisely said, in theory and practice are the same. In practice, they're not. So it is equally illuminating to speak to experienced practitioners, people with scars and blisters and stories and trophies, above all, with hard-won wisdom.
I think the days of being certain about anything are over, and it's okay. I embrace it. But I think this notion of the more uncertain things become, the more clarity we need to provide to people. And I think that you can do both. I think you can honor uncertainty and still provide clarity.
That's Anne Gotte. Anne is the SVP of Global Talent and Organization Effectiveness at Mondelēz. She's worked at Bumble, the dating app, Ecolab, significant chemical company, and another big food company, General Mills. She is wonderfully articulate and nuanced about how change might work in today's world in large organizations. In this conversation, we're going to talk about the power of clumsy, one thing that is definitely dead and buried when it comes to change, and what is probably the biggest indicator about whether your change project will work or not. Anne, hello.
Thank you. It is wonderful to be here, Michael. I'm excited to connect with you and to learn from you together during our time.
Oh, thank you. That already feels an interesting perspective, which is not just teaching, but learning as well. So I'm grateful for that. That's already given me a sense of who you are. So let me ask you a hard question right off the top. What do you know about change now that you might not have known, say, 5 years ago?
Yeah. I mean, the last 5 years is such a poignant time period to think about. I think for me, the last 5 years have put a final death knell in the idea that change is episodic and can be managed. Even this term of change management, I think, shows its age.
It's madness.
It's the HR equivalent of personnel. Yeah, it doesn't make any sense. And I think that what I know now is that change is in us, around us, happening through us all the time. And in work that we don't label as change, we actually just label it as work because that's how sort of ever-present change is. And that can sound a little cliche, but I really think that's the biggest shift. We can't manage, predict, or control change the way that decades of tools tried to prepare us to do.
That's great. In the organizations in which you've worked, I mean, do you talk about change at all, or is it just the ever-fluid, ever-evolving nature of the work that's getting done?
I mean, I think we talk about it all the time. And I think that there are shifts happening in how leaders and teams approach this notion of change, from some who still think about it as something to be predicted, sort of launched, if you will, managed and then closed, and others who are working really hard to enable what I would maybe term change capacity. How do we as an organization become more agile and expert and adaptive to the ongoing change requirements, some of which are introduced to us as requirements due to changes in customer shifts or other external factors, and some are changes that we introduce so that we can continue to grow and outpace our competitors. This notion of moving through change as something to be tolerated as we work our way to the good stuff, and instead thinking about change as the good stuff, itself, right?
How have you grown and how do you sustain your own capacity for this work?
I mean, I think some of it is part of my just general orientation to the world. I've had a life that is very full of change. I learned many, many years ago that I needed to get comfortable being uncomfortable. And so I spend most of my time uncomfortable, frankly. And it's become sort of a friend and companion to me, this notion of discomfort. But I also think that the way that we can get through change, or at least the way that I get through change, is with humility and grace. I think that change is clumsy. And I worry that maybe accidentally or in a well-meaning way, some of our earlier change work as a profession was about making change tidy, making it feel orderly and sequential and predictable. And we did that to try to make people comfortable, I think, and I appreciate that. But then when it doesn't feel that way, I can feel like, well, perhaps I've done something wrong, because this doesn't feel predictable or certain or sequenced. And so, And I think a far more generous approach is to just recognize that the messiness is the work, and that if you're feeling and experiencing that's actually part of the journey.
I'm just interrupting the flow because I just want to sit and relish that answer. I mean, I love Anne bringing to the surface her own work in getting comfortable with being uncomfortable. And also, and this is different and important, comfortable in it not having to be comfortable for other people. It really reminds me of the Otto Scharmer episode where he talks about the internal work required to be a change leader. And here I think Anne is pointing directly at that. You use the word clumsy. I love that word. Change is clumsy. What do you mean by that? It's such a powerful metaphor.
Maybe it's because I'm so clumsy. I think of that word all the time. But I think that when I think about the word clumsy or feeling clumsy, it's sort of feeling like you have two left hands or two left feet. There's an unnaturalness to it, a lack of practice, a likelihood of stumbling, and maybe even being embarrassed or found out. I think that's the other really important thing about change that we don't talk about as much with leaders to normalize, which is it's okay to feel clumsy and it's okay to feel fear. And that those things are usually an indication that you're paying good attention and that you care a lot.
The other word you used is grace, and that feels very different from clumsy, but I can see somehow that they match beautifully. What does grace mean for you?
I have a really good friend. She's been a chief people officer at a handful of organizations, and she said to me recently, what people get wrong about change is they think they have to be perfect. That's not right. What people need to get right about change is that at the end of it, whenever that is, back to does it really ever end? Did you get more right than you got wrong? Right. And did you learn along the way? And that's what I mean by grace. It's this notion of looking through, whether it's Tony Schwartz's lenses, right? Like, will this matter in a year? Does this matter if I take a broader look? And how would this matter differently to others, right? And I think that can be a real salve when you're going through this work, this notion that grace is nourishment when you're going through changes that are uncomfortable.
Before I hit record, you and I were talking just about the nature of these experiences. And, it's rare that you have one change experience where it's all light and angels singing and you bound successfully from one place to another. Just as it's unlikely that, you have another one where it's all catastrophe and all disaster the whole way around. These things are always a bit of a mixed bag. But I'm curious to know if you've started to have an opinion on kind of what are the things that mostly work these days?
Yeah. Well, I'd love to tell you something that mostly doesn't work first.
Please.
Just because as you were teeing that up, I was like, I have such a good answer. And then you shifted the question. So now I feel a little sad. So I'll tell you one thing I've learned not to do. And then I'd love to dive into your actual question.
Yeah. Please.
Post haste, I promise. One of the things that I think has really seen its useful life come to an end is this notion of decree.
Right.
Decree change, right? And I've lived through that in so many organizations. And there's kind of 3 steps to what I'll call decree change. One is that you get a small group of powerful people in a room to design a new structure or design a new program. The second thing you do is announce it as broadly and widely as the change sort of mandates or requires. And then the third is that you expect that everything will be different. And, I laugh about it because it's so silly, but it happens all the time. And what we can fail to realize if we're not careful is that organizations are living. They are full of people who have motives and interests and talents and fears. And that's about the worst way to approach a change.
And I'm going to jump in here with a hallelujah, sister. I mean, I suspect none of you listening to this are very surprised by these insights, but how lovely to hear it said so bluntly.
What I've seen start to emerge as a more sustainable and frankly human approach is to really understand not just what we need to change, but this notion of who are we today and what about any change? Forget about the specific change. We'll get there in a minute. But what about us would make any change difficult? What are the cultural barriers? How do we collaborate today? Where have we done a good job or a poor job at embedding things like curiosity and flexibility and the opportunity to fail and experiment? Because without some of these sort of change-friendly cultural behaviors, you have to take some time to understand, okay, these things are going to be hard. We are going to have to address these either parallel with a change or ideally in advance so that you've got a little bit of a buffer and capability. The second is around what are the realities of our operating model? These are in no particular order, but I think where you may need enterprise change, but you have a widely dispersed workforce or decision rights that sit in a very decentralized manner. And that's true of a lot of multinational organizations, including the one that I work in today. How will you need to influence and drive alignment and shared commitment to those changes? And then the third piece would be, what are the things about our business model that make change particularly open and flexible and accessible to us, or really difficult? And depending on what industry you're in and the way that you operate in that industry, the business model changes can be real.
This reminds me of the insights from the Leidy Klotz interview. It's actually one of the very first ones we did. And there we talk about the need to remove things that will increase the chances of success rather than our default, which is what do we need to add. Anne's got more to share here.
I think this notion of who are we and how good are we at change is a question that we often skip over. But when you take the time to do it, it can be so powerful. There's some really great work that Bain has done, and they call it their change power model.
Oh, and by the way, we're talking about Bain, one of the big management consultancies, not Bane, the villain in one of the Batman movies, just so we're clear.
I don't know if you've seen that. I think it's brilliant because what it does, and they used statistical modeling to sort of predict this for their clients. I love it because what it'll say is essentially, here's kind of your score on change power. Here's some parts of change that as a company, you're probably going to be great at. And here are some parts where, again, the word comes back to us, you're going to be clumsy. It's okay. You have a choice. Work on that now in advance of the change. Work on that as you go through the change, or suffer the consequences of ignoring it, right? But either way, there's a reality to who we are today.
Oh my goodness, it's like about an 8-hour conversation based on that answer alone. So I'm just going to get my thoughts in order here. The first question I want to ask you is this. I mean, I love where you started, which is, look, change by decree. It never worked, really. It definitely doesn't work anymore, even if you thought it did. When you see this happening, whether you're a senior executive like you are, or whether you're in an anointed change team of some sort and you can feel it coming down from above, how do you deal with that? How do you manage around it? How do you try and shift it a little bit?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's such a good question. And I think as I listen to you, what comes up for me is the quote you've probably heard. I think that the Navy SEALs use it during their training. And it's this notion that slow is smooth and smooth is fast. Have you heard that?
I have, yeah.
And I have coached leaders throughout my career that it is important to avoid confusing decrees and command with actual impact and change and growth. And so helping them understand that their power is diffuse and that the work to go slow in the beginning means that the change will be meaningfully more successful. And really the arc of time for a change impact is not weeks. usually. I mean, there are real crises and real emergencies, but most of the time we have an opportunity to make choices that set a company up for growth and success or don't. The most famous example perhaps might be the number of mergers and acquisitions that fail, right? This notion of what are all the short-term metrics that we can look at and track to show the economic value, the level of integration, the first couple of quarters of sales as an integrated entity. But really, we know that the work shows its cracks over time if we didn't go slow to go fast. So I think it's really helping them understand what they want the legacy of that change to be and what role they want to play in that versus where power, influence, design, creativity, behavior change should rightly live. And I think sometimes when leaders feel that way, there's all sorts of things involved. It could be ego, it could be a sense of pressure or achievement orientation. But sometimes I think it's about wanting to do right by their teams.
Yeah.
And so giving them a little grace to say, you don't have to carry all of this.
Right.
And in fact, it's better if you don't. Sometimes what leaders need is compassion and the sort of abdication that it's all on them 100% of the time. It's a lot of accountability that can get in the way.
Now, if you're enjoying what you're hearing so far, I bet you are, and you want to learn more from Anne, what's easiest is to follow her on LinkedIn, where she will often share and repost useful information. So that's Anne Gotte, Anne with an E, Gotte, Gotte. I really love the kind of level of curiosity you bring to this. It's like, where are we? Who are we? These are kind of lovely, existential, juicy questions that you ask, and feel, at the deepest level, this is what strategy can be. It's like, where are we and who are we and where might we choose to go? Is that just through conversation? Is it just finding the time to sit with a person and get a better sense of what's really going on for them?
Absolutely. Sometimes it can be. I think other times, depending on the nature of the change and what is bringing it about, whether it's external disruption, there's a maybe an even more formal diagnosis that you can do to understand what's shifting, what's changing around us, what is our response, what are the choices that we have. I think that it can feel like a conversation or series of conversations, but there's a formality to it in that you want to have sufficient discipline that the conversations yield insight and clarity. I think that's another important concept in this work. I think the days of being certain about anything are over, and it's okay. I embrace it. But I think this notion of the more uncertain things become, the more clarity we need to provide to people.
Right.
And I think that you can do both. I think you can honor uncertainty and still provide clarity. And I think that diagnostic is where the clarity comes from. Here's who we are. Here's what we want to do together. Here are a few ideas on how we think we can get there. What do you think? And how do we go from here,
Before I ask my next question, I want to hit pause just to call out the power of this insight, the paradox that we can honor uncertainty and still provide clarity. It's a truth, and I think you hear it in the Dan Heath episode, and it's that you must be bold and clear about the change that you're striving for, while still managing the uncertainty and the complexity of what it will take to get there. So often we get that flipped. We're a bit vague about where we're going, and then we try and lay out a very, very specific plan to get there. When you ask that question, well, who are we now? One of the answers you're probing for is kind of what is our actual change capacity?
Yeah.
How good are we organizationally at being curious? How good are we at managing ambiguity? And just as you said, and I love this framing, it feels like an ongoing building of capacity to be able to do that rather than any specific project that you're working on. As somebody who's senior in an organization, how do you influence that? Is there anything you can do about it, or is it just kind of inherent to a culture?
Oh, I think there's plenty you can do about it. I was just in a meeting with senior leaders recently, and someone asked a question in the room how good do you think we can get at this? And it was regarding something, really specific. It doesn't matter what it was about. And I smiled and said, that's up to us. It's entirely up to us. I think with change is great freedom, really.
Yeah.
And I think it's because you have the choice to decide how to show up. One of the other pieces to think about with change capacity, which is also about choices, is what are the systems and practices and skills and rewards you build in. So, as you think about any big change in a company, it almost is always accompanied by organizational design impact. So it's a pebble in a pond. You sort of make the first decision, and then it's, okay, what are all the systems that will either affirm that we meant it, that we were serious and earnest about this change, or provide face valid reasons for people to be critical or skeptical of the change. And so I think the other place to create capacity is, are we really ready to make sure all systems are go? Whether it's how we distribute resources, how we reward and recognize, how we create or redesign processes, how decisions are made. And those are all vital capacity creators, in addition to the cultural and behavioral ones you talked about.
In my experience, it's quite hard to be as encompassing as what you're describing there.
Yeah.
I've been part of many change projects where it's like, we're changing this, but actually a lot of the structural stuff's a bit tricky. So why don't we just pretend that that's going to be fine? And then surprise, surprise, the change experience doesn't quite make a difference because old structures just encourage old ways of behaving.
Yeah.
What do you do when you see a change project? Even the language feels a bit outdated, but let's call it for handiness, a change project, where you're like, we're just missing a couple of the things that if we don't add them, it's pointless to do this.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think your point is so well taken. And I've seen a few times where there can be a tendency with change, because by its very nature, it's disruptive, to try to contain it and say, what is the minimum we can do here to sufficiently advance this effort? And you're right. Often when that happens, it's sort of like a badly remodeled home. It just doesn't flow.
Exactly.
And I think that's why that pre-work is so important. This notion of, what are we hoping for, and how does this guide us on our journey towards growth? And, the other thing to do, again, back to this grace and clumsiness, is saying, and we can't do it all now. We don't have the money. We don't have the time. We don't have the capacity. Our customer demands are too high right now. We can't divert this much attention. Fine. Yeah. What are we going to do now? What are we going to do next? What are we going to do later? Yeah. So sometimes it can be about contracting with the change leader or sponsor to say, I get it. I hear you. And it's still important that we get to this. So let's think about the sequencing and the timing, and let's do the most important things first.
Just to say, as a change leader, you might want to write this down as a script, a mantra. I get it. I hear you. It's still important that we get to this.
The other thing that you can do is, sometimes in change, the reason those things don't happen is because it's a tiny, teeny team that doesn't have the capacity to influence all of those pieces. And there's a few different constraints there. Change their capacity or change the team, right? And the more people that you can sometimes involve, this is where we're trying to go. How do you think we should get there? And what are the systems that you personally are accountable for that need adjustment in light of this? I think sometimes there's this really bizarre effort to sort of harness change and harness power. And it's like, it's not supposed to be harnessed. That's not the goal. It's supposed to be embedded and feel alive and feel real. And so scoping work thoughtfully, thinking about what's now, what's next, what's later. And then this notion of, if capacity for the change leadership effort is constrained, think about why and whether it needs to stay that way.
And this has been such a great conversation, and thank you. Is there anything else that needs to be said around this?
Gosh, I think the only other thing I would mention is how important it is to listen, and this idea of who is impacted by the change and how are they feeling, not just at the beginning of a change, not sort of at key milestones, but often and in varied ways. We can be so worried about speed. I just think there is this really misguided notion
Right.
that we don't have time to listen. We don't have time to check. We don't have time to do the adjacent systems work that you referred to a few minutes ago. And we do, because if we want this to work, then we should do it well. And I think listening is really core to that. So it's probably the only other thing that is on my mind that we didn't talk about explicitly, but I think that we covered a lot.
And thank you so much. It's been a really wonderful conversation.
Likewise. Thanks so much for the opportunity.
I'm still thinking hard about needing to manage projects less and build ongoing change capacity more. Thank you for spending time here building change capacity for you and for your organization. And thank you for any support you can give the pod. Recommending an episode to a friend is my number one request, closely followed by a review on your favorite platform. And in any case, I'm glad you're doing the work. Thanks for being here.